Hello, guys. This is Paul McWhorter with TopTechBoy.com, and we're here today to talk about running with the big dogs on the NVIDIA Jetson Orin Nano. Now, I'm going to need you to pour yourself a nice tall glass of ice cold coffee. That would be straight up black coffee, poured over ice, no sugar, no sweeteners, none needed. And I'm also going to need you to buckle up because we're going to be going on a wild ride today. So what are we talking about? We are talking about the NVIDIA Jetson Orin Nano. Now, I know there's a lot of excitement about this board, and a lot of you guys are coming from the world of Arduino and the world of Raspberry Pi, and you kind of have a model in your mind of what it's like to go to the Jetson Orin Nano. And what we would normally be thinking is that the Jetson Orin Nano is a whole lot like the Raspberry Pi 5, but just faster. Now, it would be very logical to think that way. You can see here, I've got my Jetson Orin Nano here, and I've got my Raspberry Pi 5 stack here. And when you compare the two, the first thing you notice is they're both single board computers. You get them both working by flashing an operating system and putting a little SD card in the board, and then the thing should boot up and you should be off to the races. Other similarities is they both are Ubuntu machines. They're Linux machines running on Ubuntu. They both have GPIO pins. They'll both run Python, OpenCV, things like that. So at first glance, what you really notice is the similarity between the two boards. So what do you think? The Jetson Orin Nano is just a much faster version of something that's very similar, like the Raspberry Pi 5. But what you got to see is really there are some very big differences. And if you don't understand those differences, and if you don't control your expectations, or as the name of that old show, if you don't curb your enthusiasm, it's very likely that you're going to come away from your Jetson Orin Nano experience frustrated, angry with me, angry with NVIDIA, and maybe very bitter. And so the secret to having a good experience with the Jetson Orin Nano is to have the right expectations. And that's what I mean by running with the big dogs. You're not back in the little world of Arduino anymore. This is a whole new game. And what I'd like to do is I would like to talk to you about that game so that you can play it without having unrealistic expectations. Okay, so how would I describe it? What is this difference that I'm talking about between the Jetson Orin Nano and something like the Raspberry Pi 5? This is the way that I would have you think about it. Let's think about two different things. Let's think about an amusement park where maybe there's a roller coaster, and then on the other hand, let's think about skydiving. Now, what's similar between skydiving and the amusement park? Well, when you go to the amusement park and you get on that roller coaster, you're pulling big G's and your body is getting slung around and you have just this incredible thrill of excitement, right? You flash your operating system and you've got the lights blinking and you got the motor running and you got the servo moving, and it is just incredible. It's like this incredible rush riding that roller coaster of the Raspberry Pi 5, okay? But now what I want you to see is with the Jetson Orin Nano, you are not in the amusement park. You are on an airplane with a parachute. And what is the difference? Like if you jump out, I've actually gone skydiving before. I've solo skydived. And when you jump out of that airplane, what's the difference? Well, what's the same is you get the same G's, you get the same sensation, your body's thrown around, you get all that thrilling stimulation and sensation, but what's different? In the amusement park, there are guardrails, and there is no way that you can hurt yourself. Everything is going to go fine in the amusement park. Yeah, it's fun. Yeah, it's thrilling, but it's perfectly safe. What's the difference with skydiving? It's not perfectly safe. the guardrails are removed. And that's what I want you to think about the Jetson Orin Nano. I want you to think about there are no guard rules. It is not safe, and everything does not always work. And if you're going to be happy working on the platform, you need to understand that. When you jump out of an airplane to skydive, if you don't get yourself stabilized, if you go into a tumble, you can't pull the chute and you're going to hit the ground hard. Okay, the guardrails have been taken off. So let me give you some examples of kind of what I mean by not having any guardrails. As we've been playing in the amusement park with the Arduino or with the Raspberry Pi 5, we've gotten kind of spoiled. And how have we gotten spoiled? Well, we know that if we follow the instructions perfectly, we'll get the desired outcome. So you could go to the Raspberry Pi site, you could see how to flash the operating system, or you could watch my video that, okay, you get the SD card, you download the operating system, you use the flasher to flash it onto the SD card, you put it in the Raspberry Pi, and then you boot it up, and then you power it up, and then the thing boots on. If you do exactly what I say, you will get exactly the results I say. But what's different about the Jetson Orin Nano? You might go to the NVIDIA Jetson website and you might see the installation instructions and you might follow them exactly line by line, and then you flash your operating system and you put it in and you power it up, and instead of getting the happy little splash screen back here, you get a crash and you can't boot the system. So what you have to see is we are no longer on the leading edge, we are on the bleeding edge. And when you are on the bleeding edge, sometimes things don't work. And so with the recent release of Jetpack 7.2, there were a lot of people who perfectly followed the instructions and they ended up bricking their Jetson Orin Nano. And that was quite frustrating. Why? They were expecting that same Raspberry Pi 5 experience, but you don't get that. Why? Because you're running with the big dogs now. And so that's kind of what I want to talk to you a little bit about, what it means to run with the big dogs, what you should expect, and how you should run well. Okay? And so that's a little bit about what I want to talk about. So I'm trying to think some of the things. So just like other things that you're going to find is that things are changing very rapidly, and it's going to be your responsibility to keep your board working. That it's not going to be like in the past that you can just watch my video and the things that I do in my video that work for me today, those things might not work for you tomorrow. So you've got to be willing to see that the training wheels are taken off, and you're going to start having to figure out more things on your own. And so let me say that the first thing, if you're going to run with the big dogs, is you have to change your expectations. You have to be ready and you have to be willing to understand that certain things are not going to be as simple as when you were working on the Raspberry Pi 5. Okay, so now with that, you might be asking yourself, well, why do I even want to run with the big dogs? Why don't I just stay back where it's safe, back where I have guardrails on the Raspberry Pi 5? And what I want to tell you is I want to tell you the things that motivate you to move up to the Jetson Orin Nano. Now, primarily the Raspberry Pi 5, things are running on its 4 microprocessor cores. There's 4 processors on the Raspberry Pi 5. So for a little single board computer, it is pretty impressive. But what you got to see about the NVIDIA Jetson Orin Nano is that it has 6 processors. It has 6 CPU processors, but in addition to that, it has a GPU which features 1,024 cores. So you're not talking about 4 cores or 5 cores, you're talking about 1,024 CUDA cores. And in addition to those 1024 CUDA cores, you've got your original 6 CPUs, and then you've got 32 specialized tensor cores, which are optimized for solving tensor type problems. Now, you have 6-core ARM Cortex A78AE version 8.2 64-bit CPUs. So you have 6 64-bit CPUs. And now, depending on how you configure your power mode, you're looking at anywhere between 20 and 40 trillion operations per second, between 20 and 40 trillion operations per second. Now, for comparison, it's hard to do apples to apples comparison, but for a Raspberry Pi 5, you might be looking at a fourth or a half trillion operations per second. And now you're talking about 40 trillion operations per second. So you're talking about something that really can be 100 times faster when you move to the Jetson Orin Nano compared to the Raspberry Pi 5. And so that is really your motivation for upgrading, is to access that monster GPU, which is sitting on the Jetson Orin Nano. But then this is also where I have to give you a warning, that just because the GPU is there doesn't mean that the development work that you're going to do is going to move down into the GPU. And I know a lot of people that are using these Jetson products and they're having great fun, but their code is running up on the CPU and they're not even getting their code down into the GPU. And so that's the other thing that you've got to understand, is just because the GPU is there, those 1024 CUDA cores are there, that does not mean that without a little thought and planning and designing and thinking that you're going to just automatically have your code run on that part of the hardware. So you see, you got to up your game in your development projects to actually take advantage of that, of those CUDA cores. And so that's another thing that you got to see, that it's hard to necessarily get the system up and running the way you want it. And then once it's running, you have to be very mindful to get your code down on those GPUs. Now, I've talked a lot about that you hit snags even if you follow the NVIDIA how-tos exactly. You very well and very likely you are going to end up, no matter how careful you are, I can almost guarantee that you are going to end up bricking your NVIDIA Jetson Orin Nano. You're going to brick it before you get too far into your projects. Now, here is the thing. Once your Orin is bricked, it's very, very hard to unbrick. And it's not a simple matter of reflashing an SD card and putting that SD card in the board, and then all of a sudden it's like you have a factory fresh system. On the Jetson Orin Nano, there is not like a factory reset button that takes you back to the factory conditions, because part of flashing your operating system is to make changes to the firmware, which is that software that actually sits resident on the board. And if that firmware gets corrupted, creating an SD card, a new SD card, is not going to fix it. So if you really want to run with the big dogs and you really want to work on the NVIDIA Jetson Orin Nano, I'm going to tell you that you really are going to have to install the SDK manager, the NVIDIA SDK manager. Now, what is the NVIDIA SDK manager? It's a piece of software from NVIDIA that you run on a desktop machine, and then you have a cable that goes from the desktop machine that connects your SDK software, your SDK console, and connects that to the hardware of the Jetson Orin Nano. Now, once you do that, now that SDK running on a separate machine can kind of take control of the Orin, and then you can upgrade that firmware. You can fix corrupted firmware. You can install components on the operating system, or you can install the operating system system itself. So when you install the SDK manager, then all of a sudden you have a console where you are sitting in the driver's seat to fix, improve, correct, whatever, or unbrick the Jetson Orin Nano. Now that sounds great. Wow, let's jump into the SDK manager. But here is the rub. The SDK manager will not run on Windows. It will only run on an Ubuntu machine. And then you say, no problem. I've got a Raspberry Pi or I've got an extra Jetson Nano somewhere. No, the SDK manager will not run on the type of processor that you find in the Raspberry Pi or the Jetson Orin. You have to run it on a desktop type machine, but it won't run on Windows. So immediately you think, well, I'll create a virtual machine. I'll create a virtual Ubuntu box on my Windows, and then on my virtual box, I will install the SDK manager. That doesn't work either, that the SDK manager will not run on a virtual machine. Believe me, I've tried all of this, okay? It won't run on a virtual machine. Well, what's your next thought is, let's dual boot. Let's have a dual boot machine that when I power up my PC, it'll say, do you want to boot in Ubuntu or do you want to boot in Windows? And we'll just have, we'll have a hard drive partition on our desktop PC and we'll run Ubuntu in that, and we'll have a dual boot machine. Okay, that's the approach that I thought I would take. And so what I did was I took my PC, I created that partition on my PC hard drive, and then I went to do the Ubuntu installation, and then things got goofed up associated with something called BitLocker and a very low-level component that controls how an operating system works with a hard drive. And the differences between Ubuntu and Windows related to this concept of BitLocker, okay, what it did was it ended up bricking my PC. All right, so I thought, no problem. I've been diligent in creating backups, so I have this backup of my entire Windows system, so I'm just going to reload from backup. But you know what? That BitLocker error was so severe that the NVMe SSD card itself was bricked, and I could not get it to come to life. I could not get my PC to recognize it. I could not reformat it. It was like a bricked 2 terabyte NVMe card, and I had to buy a new NVMe card, and then I was able to load the backup onto it. So I'm telling you that as a warning, that if you're going to get into the NVIDIA Jetson Orin Nano, you really need to be willing and ready to run the SDK manager. And in order to do that, you need an old laptop or an old PC. Doesn't need to be high-end. It can be a very simple old machine, and you need to put on that machine an Ubuntu operating system, and then on that, a Linux Ubuntu operating system, and then on that, you need to install the SDK manager. And then from that, you'll have a computer whose sole purpose it is to be kind of a control console for your Jetson Orin Nano. And that's kind of where I have ended up. So you guys that are wanting to run with the big dogs, what I need you to do is I need you to find an old PC or an old laptop that you can kind of switch over to Ubuntu, and then you can use that for the SDK manager. Now, if you guys really want to do this, if you really want to run with the big dogs, you need to leave me a comment down below that you want me to show you how to get that SDK manager up and running on an old PC, and I'll show you how to do it. I can make a lesson on that if that's what you guys are really wanting. And so first thing is understand that we're talking about a whole new game here. We're talking about skydiving as opposed to an amusement park roller coaster. Second thing is, if you're going to run with the big dogs, you got to be able to have a standalone Linux machine that is going to allow you to control the Raspberry Pi Pico W. I mean, the Jetson Orin Nano. Okay, now the other thing that we really need to talk about is I've told you the bad news, and that is you can follow the instructions exactly and not get the desired result. And so how do we deal with that? Well, part of running with the big dogs is you've got to be able to go to the NVIDIA Jetson Orin forums, and you've got to know how to work those forums so that you can get a solution to your problem. And a lot of you guys treat comments or forums like as a place that you can gripe, and really a lot of you guys don't ask questions very well, because I get a lot of questions from a lot of you guys on just all the videos that I have up on YouTube. And a lot of times they're snarky, cranky. Well, I did that exactly, and my LED didn't come on, and then they put their code. And then you look at their code and they did a pin mode of pin whatever as an input, and then they were trying to write to it. So they sent me a snarky comment telling me that what I said didn't work when they didn't actually do what I'd told them to do. And so you've got to change your mindset. If you're going to go to the NVIDIA Jetson support forums, you've got to change your mindset. Why? Because you're running with the big dogs now, and you've got to come in there with a totally different attitude and a totally different mindset. You've got to think of yourself as the little grasshopper who is approaching the Oracle of Delphi. Okay, and you come into the Oracle with fear and trembling, and you don't come in with a snarky attitude. So if you want to get good results, if you want to get the support that you need off of the Jetson forums, you've got to know how to go there with the right attitude. So the first thing I'm going to tell you is in working these forums is, number one, don't ever ask a question on the NVIDIA forums if you have not spent 12 hours already yourself trying to work through it. Now, how do you work through it? First of all, you ask yourself, did I really follow the instructions exactly? Because when someone leaves a comment on my channel that says they did it exactly, 9 times out of 10, they didn't do it exactly. So you have got to troubleshoot what you've done. You've got to see if you can reproduce it. A lot of times you need to go back to a flat out new operating system, because even though maybe you did follow the instructions exactly, if something you had done earlier put your software libraries, your support infrastructure in a different state, that might have been what led to the instructions not working. So before you say the instructions don't work, what I like to do is I like to go back, reflash a completely fresh operating system, then follow the instructions exactly and see if I still have a problem. So number one, don't ask for support until you've spent 12 hours working on it yourself. And then what can you do during those 12 hours? Reflash the operating system and try again. Now, the other thing that you can do is search through the forums and see if someone else recently has had your exact same problem. And like recently on this issue where a lot of people were flashing Jetpack 7.2, and then in the middle of the flash, the thing crashed and they ended up with a brick, and that happens to you, you're going to look foolish. You're going to look like a newbie if you go in and say that you have this problem without looking first to see if someone else has already submitted that problem, and now you're resubmitting a new thread from scratch. Look and see someone else that has had that problem, and then start following along that thread before you go in and you start your own new thread. So you need to go in with a very humble attitude. Again, you're the grasshopper. You're approaching the Oracle of Delphi, and you don't go in there with a snarky attitude. Because also there's kind of a small group of people that are at NVIDIA that are the professionals that are working those forums to help you get to a solution. And if you waste their time with silly questions or questions that someone has already asked, they're not going to take you seriously. But what I have found is if you go in with the right attitude and you go in with the right attitude of respect, that they will never just brush you off. They will stick with you all the way to where you have your solution solved. But it's all about coming to it with the right attitude. Okay, so spend 12 hours before you post a question. Make sure you've really looked through the earlier questions. Make sure someone else hasn't done it. And then if all of that still leaves you in a bind, then you post your question. Now, a lot of times what you guys do when you post a question on my, on one of my videos, you say, oh, well, when I did this, and you're thinking that I just watched the same video that you watch, and you don't know that I'd done that 3 years ago, and I don't even remember making that particular video. So you've got to, in your question, give the information that would allow the person to ask your question. Like, what's the first thing? What is your hardware? I have the NVIDIA Jetson Orin Nano. Now, what is your operating system? Well, I was on Jetpack 6.2, and I was in the process of upgrading to Jetpack 7.2. So this is my hardware. This is where I was started. This is where I was going. And then these are the steps that I did. And you could either reference the page that has the Jetson tutorial or the how-to, or you could put the steps in. And then what is your result? When I boot the system after the flash, it dies with this error. Now, you've got to learn how to get into those error logs. You've got to learn how to look at your logs and see what it was. Because even if you don't perfectly understand that log, if you can provide the log to the forum where you're asking the question, the expert can look at that and he can kind of get an idea of what's going. So you tell the hardware, you say where you were, what you tried to do, and then you show the error logs and you give a description of what happens, that, it tries to flash for 15 minutes and then it fails at this point with this error. And then before you post, you make sure that you can reproduce it. So what do? I go and I flash a fresh operating system. I go through and sure enough, I have that problem. And then I put that in the forum question. I say, I have reflashed a fresh operating system, and I've gone through the process a second time, and the second time it had the same result. It crashed, bricked my system, blah, 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 whatever. Now, if you have that precision, then the person's going to take you seriously. Now, if they come back and say, well, the operating system is leading to this or whatever, you can't get snarky. Well, I bought this thing, and you mean you released an OS flash that doesn't work? That I bought this Jetson Orin Nano and it doesn't even have a working operating system? Once you go there, you're done. They don't have time for you at that point. They are not the marketing arm for NVIDIA. They're the technical support arm. And if you have a problem with feeling that NVIDIA promised you something you didn't get on the board, you need to take it up with marketing. You need to take it up with the people who made the PR announcement. Don't you put that load on the guy that is trying to help you on the forums. And so you don't ask questions lightly. You come with a respectful attitude. You describe exactly what the hardware was. You explain what you tried to do, what your goal was to go from 6.2 to 7.2. You show your steps. You show the result, the error log, and then you confirm with them that you tried it again with a fresh OS and you got the same result. Now, if you do that, then if they come back and tell you, do this thing, don't say, well, I already tried that. No, they are taking you through a sequence of steps. And don't tell them you already did that step. Just do the step and then report back to them the effort. But you don't argue with them. When they tell you to do something, do it and then report the result back to them. Even if you've done it before, do it and then report the result back to them. And if you maintain that respectful attitude, I have never had NVIDIA Jetson support forums abandon me. Like, well, I don't know what your problem is, mister. And, kind of like an example here with the Jetpack 7.2 upgrade, one of the really, really big deals that they were making about 7.2 is out of the box, it came Nemo Claw ready. It's like it was ready to run Nemo Claw right out of the box. And then you looked at the instructions. There were 4 steps: do this, do this, do this, do this, and then your Nemo Claw comes alive. Okay, well, I did 1, 2, 3, 4, and my Nemo Claw did not come alive. It would not answer a query, and then the whole thing was running on the CPU, not the GPU. And then when I tried to get the Nemo Claw working, what happened? Leave a comment. What happened when I tried to make Nemo Claw work on Jetpack 7.2? What happened? It bricked my system. Okay, it bricked my system. So what did I do? I went to the NVIDIA forums and I told them exactly in detail what had happened. And then they came back and then they said, okay, do this, this, this. And then I could see they were thinking kind of in not necessarily the right direction, but I did that, reported back. And then they came back and they said, well, this, and I just said that. And then they came back to me and they say, we have confirmed, we have been able to reproduce your error and we are working on it. Okay, progress. Because they're real smart guys. Once they see there's a problem, they can figure it out. 2 days later, they came back and they say, okay, these are the instructions of how to do it. And they were different than the original instructions, but I did those instructions and what? I now have a Jetson Orin Nano, which will boot. That's good. And which will run Nemo Claw. And that's good. And which will run Nemo Claw on the GPU. Okay, so I got there, but it wasn't as easy as getting somewhere on the Raspberry Pi 5. Now, what happened then? What happened then is that when I ran Nemo Claw on the Jetson Orin Nano on the GPU, immediately the board overheated and threw a thermal error and throttled the thing down. And then it started entering into this thing where it was going from when it would throttle the GPU, it would push the workload up to the CPU. And then in a few seconds or tens of seconds, when things cooled down, it would go back. And so it was sitting there taking the workload from the CPU to the GPU. And in doing that, if you looked at what it was doing, it was actually slower than if you had just run it from the top on the CPU. So have I gotten to the destination that I want yet? No. But what have I done? I have curbed my expectations. I have curbed my enthusiasm, and I have lower expectations. And I understand that running with the big dogs mean I'm going to have to do some work to get to that end point. And so now what I'm looking at is I'm looking at issues associated with that 25-watt mode on the NVIDIA Jetson Orin Nano. And what I'm finding is you can't just come in and willy-nilly come up here to this little icon and say power mode, run in the super max, run in the 25-watt mode super. No, you can't just do that. Or the 25-watt mode. I think I am in 25-watt mode. You can't just run in the 25-watt mode. You might need to slow it down a little bit. You might need to turn the volume down a little bit so that that workload will stay down on the GPU. Okay, guys, let me know if this makes sense, because I've gotten a whole lot of positive feedback that you guys are asking for a class, and some of you guys have already ordered your Jetson Orin Nano, but leave me feedback. Do you understand what I'm saying? Because I don't want to make a class and then have you guys yell at me and be snarky and toxic in the comments because I might show you something in a video that I made today that might not work exactly right the next day without you having to tweak a little or look a little or kind of look into things, because the operating system I'm working on today, if you take the class in a month and you did a sudo apt update and a sudo apt upgrade, you might be working on a very different set of dependencies and underlying libraries like the Tensor Core libraries or the NumPy or the OpenCV. If those are different, then you might have to tweak things from what I did. Okay, guys, this has been a little bit different lesson, but give me feedback. Do you understand what I'm saying? Are you willing? Do you still want to run with the big dogs? And do you understand the price that comes from running with the big dogs? Okay, guys, I do hope you're having as much fun with this NVIDIA stuff as I am. I really am kind of getting excited about making a class. What I am thinking about is I'm thinking about maybe starting with just dropping some one-off how-to lessons. Like I've already shown you how to flash Jetpack 7.2. I've also showed you how to get the Llama and Ollama running on the Jetson Orin Nano, where you have a local large language model that's pretty impressive running on your own hardware. I think the next thing that I could do is show you how to get that model working down on those GPUs and not just up at the CPU. And then, you know, what I could sort of start seeing is that trying to get a little bit of an agent going on the Jetson Orin Nano and connecting some stuff up to the GPIO pins, where you have a project that you could interact with in a very natural language. Okay, guys, leave me feedback and let me know what you're thinking about these things, because again, I'm still trying to kind of gauge what the user interest would be in such a new class. Okay, guys, I am going to let you go now. Paul McWhorter with TopTechBoy.com, and I will talk to you guys later.